welcome to EconVersations. I'm your host, Dr. Dan Sutter of the Johnson Center for Political Economy at Troy University. The presidential campaign of 2016 is underway, and political campaigns often make economists cringe because of the things that politicians, voters, and reporters will often say about economic policy. What are the economic views of Americans, and do Republicans and Democrats, or liberals and conservatives, have differing economic views? What economic falsehoods do people tend to hold? And is there some reason why people might be prone to hold incorrect economic views? Joining me on EconVersations today to talk about some of his research on Americans' economic views is the Executive Director of the Johnson Center, Dr. Stephen Miller. Welcome back to the show, Steve.
Thank you, Dan.
So before we get started here, people often describe themselves to claim that they're liberal or conservative, but in making such claims or self-descriptions, there's no rules that they have to follow. But so in conventional political parlance, what's a liberal versus what's a conservative?
So a conservative is going to be someone who tends to favor tradition. Mm-hmm. That's going to be common to any definition of conservative. What that means in the U.S. probably is a strong tendency to want to see businesses do well, to consider yourself pragmatic, both in terms of economic and foreign policy, and to value the stability on some level. For liberals, one of the prime examples of things liberals care about is equality. They care about social progress, and that can mean a number of different things to different people, but social progress, equality, and often it takes the form of supporting policies that are viewed to protect labor, regulations that constrain businesses and corporations.
Now, the use of the term liberal has changed over the years, right? If you went back 150 years ago and asked somebody if they were a liberal, the types of people who'd say that they were a liberal maybe 150 years ago would be very different than what we see today. How has that term changed over the years?
So the term liberal, once upon a time, probably would have meant something along the lines of someone who viewed government as a threat and sought to constrain the role of government, both in the market but in the lives of individuals. Mm-hmm. So government was seen 150 years ago in the U.S. as the primary threat to individual liberty and social progress. What's probably happened is people who call themselves liberal no longer view government as the primary threat to individual liberty. They may view it as corporations, mm-hmm. They may view it as religion. It depends on the liberal, but they no longer necessarily view government as the primary threat to liberty and progress.
And so the term liberal at one point in time it also meant, referred to the idea of progress and humanity and conditions getting better over time as well. So it's not insignificant what we call liberal, right?
Right.
Well, you've done a lot of research on what types of economic views that Americans have. Now, given that, probably the fundamental and enduring economic question comes back to the question of what's the appropriate role for government in the economy, it's probably not going to be a surprise that there should be some kind of link between people's economic views and their political views, right? That's
correct, and there most certainly is a connection between people's economic views and their political views.
So tell us a little bit about the research that you've done. There's a couple. We're going to talk today about a couple of papers that you've published, and so tell us a little bit about the type of data you're using. Was this from surveys, and a little bit more about this?
Okay, so I've done research where, including these articles, where I rely heavily on a couple of data sets. One is the General Social Survey, and the other is the Survey of Americans and Economists on the Economy. This research on political ideology and economic beliefs is all using the General Social Survey. So mm-hmm. The General Social Survey is a large national survey, Dan, that is given to literally thousands of Americans, and it's administered every 2 years now. And it's done by the National Opinion Research Center, which is headquartered out of the University of Chicago, but Berkeley and the University of Michigan are also very involved in this research project. And the idea is to build just a very large social science public opinion data set.
And this is available then for other researchers to come in and look at some of the different questions and do their own analysis of different social trends?
Yes. So there are thousands of people maybe around 2,000 people surveyed every year in this survey. Now it increased over time, but there are many, many thousands of questions that are administered. So it's a very broad-ranging survey, and it really covers all kinds of demographic characteristics of the interviewees, but it also includes their views on, many hundreds of topics.
So let's talk about some of the economic views that you took a look at in this work and how they relate up to political views.
So there are a number of economic views that we asked about, that the survey asks about, that I was looking at, and it ranges from people's views of the role of government in the economy in an abstract sense, to some very specific questions about what the government should be doing in a particular situation in terms of setting wages or setting prices, or how involved they should be in particular industries. So I see you have a slide up here. One of the categories of questions was about government ownership of the means of production, which is kind of the central debate of the early 20th century in economics, and was about what the government should own and operate.
That was, in essence, the term socialism that you might hear bandied about and sometimes used as to criticize government proposal today. Socialism actually referred to the ownership of these means of production, right?
Right. So in the early 20th century, the big debate was these large, significant industries, whether it's energy, whether it's mining, whether it's transportation, like the railroad companies and things like that, whether these should be government-owned, state-owned, or whether they should be privately owned. So this is a debate that still is in people's minds today. So it's part of the general social survey. And so they ask a series of questions. Should the government own electric companies? Should it own steel manufacturers? And should it own banks and insurance companies? And what we see in the results is liberals are more likely than conservatives to favor government ownership of those enterprises, which I don't think is a real surprise. But I did notice that is a systematic difference between conservatives and liberals, that liberals are much more likely to advocate public ownership, state ownership of the means of production.
But another thing to note here is that the numbers, which reflect percentages, are all pretty small.
They're all pretty small. So if we're talking about the U.S. population, there are not a lot of true socialists left, is what I would conclude from that. Even among political liberals, most would not consider themselves socialists, and they'd be correct not to consider themselves socialists, because very few actually favor state ownership of the means of production.
So there does seem to be at least one element of something like a consensus amongst Americans on their economic views.
Yes.
Now, there are some other areas of policy where there are somewhat larger differences between conservatives and liberals, right?
And so these are three questions, and I did find these questions particularly interesting. One is because they're normative. They bring in people's value judgments. So the first question up here we have is, has business become too powerful? And what we see is there's kind of two ways to look at the response to this question. One is that a majority of liberals believe, yes, business has become too powerful, and a minority of conservatives hold that view. However, it's a large minority of conservatives that hold the view that business has become too powerful, and a small majority of liberals that hold that view. But still, it is a significant difference. Another one, which we would think is kind of a fundamental difference between conservatives and liberals, is about private enterprise itself. And so the question phrased it as, it's an agree or disagree. Private enterprise is the best way to solve America's problems. Most conservatives agree with that statement. A full 65% of conservatives agree with that. And a minority of liberals agree with that. And that is a pretty big difference between conservatives and liberals. The last question I have up here is, business profits are distributed fairly. Far more liberals than conservatives believe that, or I think this is also flipped, right? But far more conservatives and liberals would agree that business profits are distributed fairly. But in both cases, it's a minority, that they would both agree. Majorities of both conservatives and liberals would agree that business profits are not always distributed fairly, and that there's a problem there.
So there are differences, and I guess they end up being statistically significant, and you're trying to control for them and everything. But they're not huge differences.
Right, they're not always huge differences. One of the largest differences I found actually was on the question of private enterprise and whether that's the best way to solve America's problems.
So if people have different opinions about some of these, I guess you said normative questions or more sort of fundamental questions of how effectively the business system operates, our market system operates, then it's probably not going to be surprising if they then have differences about specific questions about what, whether passage of Dodd-Frank was a good idea or not is going to depend on some of your attitudes towards these more fundamental questions, right?
That's correct.
And so would we say that people disagree about specific policies because of these more fundamental differences that they hold between, say, liberals and conservatives? Or do you think it's maybe going the other way around, that people who disagree about policy end up having different views on these more fundamental issues?
Well, that's a good question. I think it's a little of both. I think there are going to be systematic belief differences between conservatives and liberals on economics, that they are going to have their priors when it comes to economic issues that they bring to the table when looking at an issue. But one thing that is very interesting to observe is how quickly either conservatives or liberals will kind of flock to the view that they feel is held by their team in general. And so even when it appears to be the same principle at stake, how their views seem partially dependent on what the rest of the group they identify with believes.
Mm-hmm. Well, some of the research you've done is just again, sort of characterizing these differences between liberals and conservatives, and you've also done some work on looking at some of these same questions and how the breakdown goes between Democrats and Republicans. And so if you could just mention a little bit of the Democrat-Republican differences, and do they map what we see with liberals and conservatives?
For the most part, the Democrat and Republican differences map what I found with liberals and conservatives. There are a few interesting exceptions here and there. Sometimes the exceptions are centered around issues related to international trade. Sometimes they're centered on immigration, where it may be that there's a slight difference between conservatives and Republicans more generally. But for the most part, the vast majority of questions, the results for political party identification and for political ideology, liberal conservative, are the same.
So although people, at one level can self-identify themselves as conservatives or liberals, there's actually a decent amount of consistency, seemingly, about the views they hold and how they're describing themselves.
Yes.
Now, some other research looks at a slightly different, but I think ultimately somewhat more difficult to get at question, and that is issues about people's views on the economy and whether or not they hold what you characterize as biased views or not.
Right.
What would a biased view be like compared to simply what you're trying to do here is say, lay out what people's views on the economy are? What would constitute a quote biased economic view?
So there are probably different ways to use the word bias, but in its most basic form, the word bias means some systematic tendency in your beliefs, in your priors, that pushes you away from the truth. Mm-hmm. So that's a basic definition of bias. Now, to operationalize that in the research, I had to go a little further.
Okay. So you're looking at some views that people might hold that we would have some basis on which to say these are incorrect or false falsehoods that they are believing, right?
Right.
And so how would you go about characterizing some of these views as false? I mean, you look at some of these and say, like, well, I believe businesses are too powerful, and how can you tell me they're not too powerful? Right. So how did you go about trying to characterize what we can now count as perhaps a false economic view? So
the way we did that was by using a proxy for the truth, and it's not an absolute version of the truth, but the proxy we used for the truth, what we thought would be, and so this is this is based on my own research, but this came from joint research I did with an economist named Brian Kaplan at George Mason University. And the way we got at the notion of truth versus bias was, there's Brian right there. Brian, and this builds on the research he did for his book, The Myth of the Rational Voter. the closest thing we can come up with for a proxy to the truth is what is the economic consensus, if there is one. And by that I mean a consensus of professional PhD economists. Mm-hmm. And that's not always going to be the truth, whatever it absolutely is, but our argument, and Brian's argument in particular in his book, but I use the argument in my own research as well, is that if you have a very strong, solid majority of trained economists who have studied the issue, in many cases for decades, if this is their view, that's probably closer to the truth than a random sample of the U.S. population. So when we talk about systematic bias, or when I talk about systematic bias, what I mean is when there is a strong, significant difference away from the economic consensus on an issue.
Now, some of our viewers might be skeptical to think that, well, sure, but all economists are in favor of free markets. So when you talk about something like this isn't necessarily going to be biased. Our measure of what the truth is necessarily going to be biased in certain fashions, simply because of the fact that all economists believe in markets so much and perhaps unrealistically so. So is it true that all economists are truly big free market supporters?
Right. So it's not true. And one of the only way to respond to that claim, where people say, well, how do you know economists aren't biased? We know, people will argue that we know economists are biased because they're all free marketers, or they're all rich, or they all have incredible job security. And so those claims have to be dealt with. To honestly reject that argument that economists are the ones who are biased, we have to look at the reasons why people would say they're biased and see if they hold water. Mm-hmm. So one is that economists are all kind of right-wing free market ideologues. That's one of the premises that people hold when they say that economists are the ones who are biased. Well, it turns out it's just not true. So the median economist, there's plenty of survey literature of economists to back this up. The median economist is a moderate Democrat. So is not politically Republican, and is moderately liberal, is not politically conservative especially. Mm-hmm. And if you look at their views, the median economist is not some clone of Milton Friedman out there. It's someone who holds a pretty mixed view of the role of government in the economy. Mm-hmm. So that suggests that economists aren't biased for that reason. Now, if you look at things like income and job security, the way to handle that is, when you're looking statistically at economists' views, is you control for those things. And when you control for those things, you don't see any big difference in the results. That economists, the result for economists and their views about economics and where an economic consensus comes from, it isn't apparent that it comes from job security or high levels of income, and it certainly doesn't come from political ideology.
So there's work from Brian Kaplan and your work suggesting that people hold some economic falsehoods. Now, it turns out that economic falsehoods, if you hold them, and especially on political questions, are going to be perhaps less costly than other types of falsehoods you might hold in your own life. And this comes back to some basic issues about how elections function and how they operate, right? And so tell us a little bit about this idea that the public choice economists came up with about rational ignorance.
Okay, so rational ignorance is the notion that it's often rational for people in their political lives, and I would say also in their views about economics, it's rational for people to not know what's going on politically, what the consequences of a particular policy would be, whether or not a particular politician running for office would be the better choice. Mm-hmm. The reason it's rational is because learning all of that information would require investing a lot of time. It would be costly in an important way, probably in terms of the most scarce resource we have, which is our time and effort. Mm-hmm. So it would be very costly, and the consequences are very low. If you vote for the wrong person or vocally support a policy that turns out to have higher costs than benefits, what does that really mean to you? Well, if it's a popular policy, it actually means nothing for you. It means you supported a popular policy, and maybe people like you all the more. It doesn't really harm you to be wrong about politics, and I would argue that in many cases, especially with macroeconomic issues and things like that, it doesn't cost a typical person much to be wrong. But there are often benefits to saying and expressing your beliefs vocally.
Whereas, like, if we look at other types of beliefs you might have, if you don't believe in the law of gravity, or somehow, or if you don't believe that, cars need a certain amount of time to stop if you're traveling 50 miles an hour, I mean, there are going to be some real consequences in your own life. Your life is going to be hurt. You're going to be hurt in various different ways if you hold some false ideas in our everyday lives, right?
Right. Well, you mentioned cars. I actually knew a fellow in high school who did hold the belief that cars don't need their oil changed, that it's a sham brought about by Jiffy Lube, or I don't know, the auto government complex. So he never changed the oil on his car, and he quickly learned the consequences of holding that false belief. His car came to a screeching halt one day when the engine seized and was a giant lump of worthless metal and wheels. So that's an example of how costly our beliefs can be if they're wrong in the practical everyday world. This goes back to the question about who's biased, economists or the public. I'm not sure economists bear a lot of the costs for being wrong, but they do bear some costs for being wrong about economic issues, and they certainly bear more costs for being wrong about economics than average laymen do.
And I think probably the average economist becomes an economist in part because they're just intrinsically curious about how the economy operates. So, I mean, I think probably a lot of what they're trying to do is just learn about the economy, so they have a desire to try and figure out what is actually going on. So let's get into some of these actual types of biases that I think Brian Kaplan is laid out these this categorization of different types of biases or falsehoods that people might hold in their economic views. We have 4 of them here, so tell us a little bit about what they are.
Okay, so the first one is anti-market bias, and this is a tendency to view markets as a threat to stability, as a threat to progress. So it's a tendency to view market activity, voluntary exchange, in a suspicious way. And it takes many forms, but it's very interesting how consistent it is that among the general public in surveys, how much distrust there is of markets and really voluntary exchange fundamentally.
And so that's just not just markets, but also like distrust of big business that falls under that as well?
One way that anti-market bias manifests itself in survey questions is the way people view the relationship between sellers and buyers, between employers and employees. For someone who holds a high degree of anti-market bias, which is many people in the general public, they're going to tend to view economics as an unfair fight between the big guy and the little guy. And the big guy is big business. It's big business, and it's whether it's treating people as employees or whether it's treating people as customers, that they're out to get them. But of course, the problem with that view that economists are fairly good at articulating in their better moments is that that's not a very good way to do business, to harm the consumer, right? If you're selling a product that's, for example, making people sick or is in some other way harming people, or if you're just charging them a whole lot, well, in a competitive market, that seems highly unlikely. And one of the most important features of a market is, for it to function properly, it has to be open to competition. Doesn't mean there has to be, at any moment, many competitors, but it has to be open to competition. And rarely do we see markets that are closed to competition without the intervention of government. So that's a bit of the background and discussion that surrounds anti-market bias.
And then we also have like a make-work bias, and then I think this goes back to the general tendency of people to view jobs very differently than economists do, right?
Right. So the real question, I guess, behind make-work bias is, are jobs a good thing that an economy produces, or are jobs actually a cost? So an efficient economy, a growing economy, is going to find ways, entrepreneurs and other innovators are going to find ways to conserve labor. They're not going to be going out of their way to make jobs. They're going to be figuring out how can we produce more with less. And producing more with less includes producing more goods and services with less labor, with less capital, with less land, because that's what a thriving, dynamic economy does, is it figures out how to make more with less. And then those resources, including labor, are freed up to make yet other things. And that's the thing that probably separates, when I think about the economic way of thinking and how economists differ from non-economists, probably the biggest or one of the biggest differences is just how they view labor and other scarce resources. Do you want these things to be used up, or do you want to free them up? A well-functioning economy is actually freeing these things up as it progresses.
And more quickly, like the anti-foreign bias and pessimistic bias as well, right?
Right. So anti-foreign bias is simply being distrustful of foreigners, especially whether that's immigrants seeking work or foreign trade in particular. There are many questions about international trade in these surveys. And then pessimistic bias is just a tendency to view the world as being bad and getting worse at all times in every way. When it comes to economic views, pessimistic bias means that you view the economy as being bad and getting worse.
Which is in contrast with the fact that prosperity has been increasing, right?
Right. I mean, especially since the 19th century, and especially in countries like the U.S., where you have just seen tremendous improvements in economic well-being.
And so do liberals and conservatives differ in their likelihood to hold these different biases?
Yeah, so I found some interesting differences, which is both conservatives and liberals are prone towards pessimistic bias, and both in their own way are prone to make-work bias. I found that liberals are slightly more prone to make-work bias. But it was very clear that liberals are more prone to anti-market bias than conservatives are, that they're more likely to view markets as suspicious, as suspect, and conservatives are much more likely than liberals to hold various forms of anti-foreign bias.
Well, in one sense, the fact that people might have some views about the economy that are incorrect isn't that surprising, because our division of knowledge in society allows us to use a lot of things. Like here's the example here of electricity,
Right.
where we don't have to know what is involved with creating power for us to turn on the light switch. We can just turn it on. But markets are like that too, right?
Right. Well, it would be, even for a trained microeconomist, it would be impossible to go learn how every market that you deal with on a daily basis actually works. What's going on there, what the scarce resources are, and how entrepreneurs have created that market from nothing. Most markets that we engage in every day never existed. You know, the market for electricity in your home is something that once upon a time never existed. So that's a really good example, and I like it. But that's true of most things. Even if you're a trained electrician and you work in the electric industry and you say, well, I know what happens when I flip on the switch. I know exactly. I'm an engineer or I'm an electrician and I understand how all of that works. Well, there's some aspect of your daily life, some market, some part of your life that you take for granted that you don't know how it works. And it's the same way with markets, that it's a spontaneous order. There are orders out there. Markets are the result of human action, but not of human design. And it's uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable, especially for non-economists, but it's probably even uncomfortable for economists, that we don't control these things. We don't control what's going on. I'll stop there.
Well, thanks very much, Steve. Enjoy the conversation. And thank you for joining us. Join us again next time for another EconVersations.